This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review. Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review. I'm Dahlia Shenlin. Unfortunately, Gilad Halpern is not with us this week, but he'll be back. If you like us, please consider becoming a Patreon supporter by going to our homepage, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review. Scroll to the bottom and click the big red button that says Patreon because we're counting on you. Every week, we bring you interviews with authors of books and researchers, people we think are interesting. This episode is sponsored by the German government. Germany is now holding the EU presidency for the second half of 2020. And as our listeners know, the Tel Aviv Review is holding a special series examining Israel's relationship with the EU and European countries with their generous support. Our guest today is an expert on the one thing that everybody is talking about in these parts, the great détente between Israel and parts of the Arab world. Dr. Moran Zaga is a researcher and a lecturer in the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies at the University of Haifa, focusing on political and social boundaries, the history of borders in the Arab world, and the geopolitics of the Gulf states. Moran is also a policy fellow at Mitvim, the Israeli Institute for Regional Foreign Policies. Disclosure, I'm also affiliated there. She researches the cooperation between Israel and the United Arab Emirates there. We'll be discussing her various articles and papers on this topic. Moran Zaga, welcome to the show.
Hi, Dahlia. Thank you for having me.
You've spent time in the Gulf, and I want you to try to give us a broad picture of some of the political dynamics in the Gulf. It's this sort of distinct part of the Arab world. In Arabic, we call it the Khaliji, right?
Mm-hmm, true.
What does the political landscape of this region look like?
Right. So we usually portray them as 6 countries under one umbrella, the Arab Gulf states. But there's actually a big difference between one state and another. If we're talking, for example, about Oman, so Oman is very different. First of all, it has a heterogeneous society, much more than the other Arab Gulf states. And now we know that the ruler, the Sultan, changed 6 months ago, and I think that this is it has one of the reasons for maybe the setback or the fact that we still don't hear anything from the Omani side. It has to do with the fact that this is a new ruler in the region, and he still needs to solidify his rule or his legitimacy.
Which is interesting because if we think about just before, I think the April 2019 elections, all of a sudden Netanyahu had a surprise visit, right, to Oman, and we don't hear about it anymore.
Right, and that was under the Sultan Qaboos regime. And now we're talking about a new sultan, and he really needs to base his legitimacy. Then we have, if we're going geographically, we have the UAE, but we're going to talk about it so much this show. So I'm going to Qatar, for example. So Qatar, we know that it has a different Islamic landscape in the region. We might see them as the more radical voice. We know that there is, for example, the Al-Qaldawi Mosque is situated there, and they host the political wing of Hamas, and they are affiliated with the Muslim Brotherhood, but on the same level, they did host the Israeli diplomatic representatives until 2009. So it is a very interesting country, and it still negotiates with Israel in issues concerning the Palestinian arena. Then we have Bahrain. Bahrain is a small country with also a heterogeneous population. We have Sunnis and Shias. And their challenges is much, much more acute than the other countries. And we'll see that, I think, even in the near future, when Israel will be interested to cooperate, to collaborate with this country, they will face many more difficulties than, for example, with the UAE. That's what I think. We have Kuwait. Kuwait is a neutral country. It does not want to negotiate in Israel until now by any means, because it shows a great support for the Palestinians, and it also it belongs to the countries that sees Iran as a threat, also to itself. But still, it doesn't mean that a shared enemy, in Kuwait's case, is a platform for joining forces with Israel. So that's Kuwait. Oman, as we said earlier, Oman is not really in the Gulf and not really with Iran. It talks with everyone. It really plays the player of the bridge, of the arbitrator between the forces. So it's a very interesting country to look at. And of course, above all, we have we have Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is a very interesting country to us because it's the most important country in the Arab and the Muslim world. And it seems that everyone are now looking at Saudi Arabia to see what will be the next step. Will there be joining this party, if you can call it so, and try to bring their own power to the region, to this important step.
Well, this is fascinating because we have two, I think, tracks that we need to understand. One is a little bit deeper within that political landscape. I want to understand the kind of cooperative interests and differences between those states and their alignments with each other. And I also want, of course, to talk about the Israel track. So let's just stay with their internal relations. How do those different countries break down in terms of their own relationships? Can you point to alliances or differences?
Right. So we have the known alliance, a familiar alliance between Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain. We can add to that more countries that are not situated in the Gulf, such as Sudan, such as Egypt and Jordan. They are all part of this alliance, this coalition. Sometimes they call it sometimes a much deeper alliance. We saw there are joining forces in the war against Yemen, in diplomatic steps against Iran, and in the GCC, the Gulf Cooperation Council. They are very much aligned with each other. And we have Qatar on the other hand. This is a very, very old hostile environment, I would say, between Qatar and the Arab Gulf states. But we didn't hear about this hostility until 2017, when the boycott was announced between the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Bahrain, and to Qatar.
What is the historic depth of that competition or hostility? You said hostility.
Right. So competition or hostility is a very, very important question because in my interpretation, it's much more as a competition. And what the other Sunni states, the UAE, the Saudis, and Bahrain are trying to portray now is to draw an imaginary boundary between the good guys and bad guys, between the moderate countries and the radical country, naming Kuwait. And we all know that it's something that is open to many interpretations.
Wait, let me get this straight. Saudi Arabia is in the moderate category?
This is how they portray themselves in the last 2, 3, 4, 5 years.
Gotcha.
This is something that Mohammed bin Salman, the current ruler, actually the crown prince, is working hard to brand the country as the moderate one. This is why, for example, we saw rapprochement with Judaism, not with Israel, but with Judaism. This is like an indirect way to show that they're open to other cultures, to other religions, and by that, to other states. And this is a way to show their openness, to their tolerance. This is also a branding that we see now in the Emirates. And Bahrain is known for this for many years because it has a Jewish community and it has different religions and different sects. So Bahrain has always tried to show themselves as such a tolerant country and a moderate country. And you know that there is much truth in it because Qatar is hosting, as we said, Al-Qadawi Mosque, but also Al Jazeera. And these countries, meaning the UAE, the Saudis, and Bahrain, they are they were threatened by the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring almost didn't touch Saudi Arabia and the Emirates. It did touch Bahrain. Bahrain suffered from it a lot, and the Saudis helped them.
Help them what? Suppress it?
Exactly, the protest in Manama. And but it doesn't mean the fact that the Arab Spring didn't touch the Saudis and the Emirates, that doesn't mean that they were not concerned about the consequences and about the fact that one day it may erupt in their own territories. So they saw Qatar as the country that were helping to incite.
Because of Al Jazeera.
Because of Al Jazeera covering the first protests in Egypt, for example. And this is only one example. Then how to cover that? So they thought that they taking a more radical line by covering these protests and making them bigger than they actually were. So that was the line that that the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Bahrainis were trying to say that as to why they think that Qatar is not a part of the moderate world that they are trying to be part of, if we're talking about the post-Arab world.
But it sounds like their version of moderate has a lot to do with political unrest versus political stability. And are you using the term moderate in terms of religion? I mean, are they accusing Qatar of being a base or a force of Islamic radicalism?
So we're talking here about political Islam. Of course, that it doesn't mean that there are not religious people in Bahrain or in the Emirates. Actually, I know many of them who tells me that we see ourselves as more religious than the people of Qatar. The Emiratis are telling me that they are more religious, that there are people than the Saudis, for example. But their religion, according to, of course, we're generalizing this, but according to many of my friends, their religion is a personal one. It's in their nature, but it's not intertwined in the national politics. This is according to their view. And that, I think, is the main difference between, if we're talking specifically about the difference between the UAE and Qatar, I would point on that thing.
Okay. Now, before we get too much deeper into the Gulf, let's talk about this détente. Can you just bring us all up to date on this flowering of relations between Israel and UAE and Bahrain, and maybe we can even touch on Sudan?
So in the last decade, and maybe if we'll zoom into the last 5 years, we see a great rapprochement. We see a trend that is going on between Israel and the UAE, slightly with Bahrain, but more with the UAE, of more and more dimensions where the countries are sharing the same platforms or actually cooperating in direct fields. But most of the platforms, most of these things that we see in this trend is part of a larger trend, which is the UAE trying to be a hub. It's trying to be a center for many multinational or multicultural gatherings, meetings, conferences. I'll give you only a few examples. So we have the Expo 2020, and we have the agency, the UN Agency for Renewable Energies that Abu Dhabi hosts. And we have so many international conventions and conferences that are taking place in Dubai, in Abu Dhabi, in Sharjah, in many places of the UAE. And Israel is a part of them. We'll take, for example, the sports tourneurs that we heard of, the international judo tournament or the tennis. And we have great, thank God, we have great tennis players and judo players. And they asked to be part of these international games. And due to this multinational nature of the events taking place in this country, Israel became part of this trend of the UAE trying to be a hub, succeeding in it. Now we see that, or we portray that, as a direct rapprochement, but it's not necessarily so. It means that the UAE really wanted to be a country that hosts it wanted to take this role, to take the leadership of the world coming into their territory. And Israel is only part of that. So it's very much, I would say, affiliated with the nature of the UAE. And this is why I think we didn't see this rapprochement with other Arab states on the same level, for example, with Sudan. Because with Sudan, we didn't have many, platforms in which we could be on the same spot.
It's interesting because you say UAE has been advancing this role or this image of itself for a number of years already. And that, to my mind, raises the question of, the rapprochement or the Israeli agreement with the UAE is being portrayed as this great diplomatic breakthrough brought to us by Benjamin Netanyahu and Donald Trump. And now what I'm wondering from you was it really all their breakthrough and their achievement, or is this part of a more consistent policy that the UAE has been developing over recent years, before Trump, for example, maybe with Netanyahu's support because he's been around for a lot longer?
Right, it's exactly that. And to continue the last point, so the UAE became a hub because it wants to be a regional power, not less than that. And it's important to understand in order to really grasp the reason for these Abrahamic Accords. The UAE wants to be a regional power. It means that it has to be influential in the region. Being influential, you need to do several steps. Among them is to be a host of international events of any kind. It can be civil events, it can be diplomatic events, and of course, economic events. And it really much succeeded in doing so. So this is where we saw Israel and the UAE coming together. But if we're doing a zoom out and we're trying to see what is the UAE trying to do here, we see the foreign policy of this country, of the UAE, much more being proactive in the last more than 5 years. We saw the country much more involved in, for example, regional conflicts, but also in regional arbitration between the Taliban and the US, between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And of course, we talked about the boycott on Qatar. The UAE was a prominent part of that. So we saw that we are all talking about the soft power and the hard power. We know, I believe that the listeners know about these two terms. And the Arab Gulf states were excelled in soft power, in their diplomatic foreign affairs. They didn't want to take the dirty laundry out. But now they're trying to be much more, to take the hard power diplomatic tool by boycotting Qatar, by going into wars, by being more vocal against Iran, for example, but also trying to continue the soft power and influence by soft power activities such as, for examples, in these international conventions.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's an interesting combination, the soft power and hard power one, where they're both, demonstrating military ambitions and I assume also economic ambitions when you talk about being a regional power. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, also this sort of diplomatic, friendly, involved in conflict resolution kind of approach. Is it unusual or is it possible for a country to demonstrate power by advancing both hard traditional power through economic and military means and simultaneously be the peacemaker and the nice guy and the soft power? I mean, is that a normal combination of things? Do you think, let me ask you like this, do you think it will work? Do you think that combination will propel UAE to be this dominant regional power when it has many competitors for being a regional power in the Middle East?
Well, first, after the Arab Spring, it does not have so many competitors. Now, I think that the Gulf states did earn, if we can say, from domestic troubles in other countries that used to dominate the Arab arena. For example, in Egypt, Syria, Iraq, Libya. They were really dominant until 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But now I think that due to the fact that the Arab Gulf countries did not suffer as much from the demonstrations, I think that first of all, there are not so many competitors, and the competitors are within the Arab Gulf states. So it's interesting because it has much to do with the maybe the accelerated conflict between Qatar and the other Arab Gulf states, because now the projector is on them. So if you're asking about the soft and the hard power, going to that question, of course, it goes together for regional power, of course.
Well,
So,
I guess what I'm really thinking also is that there is one other country that is trying very hard to be a regional power that we haven't really talked about yet, and that's Iran, which overshadows so many of these dynamics. I mean, UAE seems like a tiny little Gulf country. How can they possibly compete with Iran's attempt to be a dominant power primarily, it seems, through military tactics?
So, first of all, of course, if you're talking about the opening point of Iran and the UAE, we can barely compare between the two in terms of size, in terms of military capabilities, in terms of history, and I can go on. But let's see today's stability charts, and we'll see that the UAE is really starring at the top of the table. It's the most stable country in the Middle East and one of the more stable countries in the world in terms of, in international scoring. It really heads all the other Arab Gulf states and all the other Arab states and Muslim states in the region. So the US succeeded building its own military capabilities in addition to the security umbrella of the US. But now, adding to that, the fact that the US is now getting more and more concerned in domestic issues, and it's like the America First paradigm. So we see that the UAE is getting more and more concerned about its own security. Last year, if we're talking about the summer of 2019, there were some very troubling issues in the Persian Gulf and in the Omani Gulf, in which within the territorial water of the UAE, some vessels were hit.
Are you implying that Iran carried out the strikes, but we don't really know?
Yeah, they didn't really take responsibility, but Iran, but they were born
presumed to be Iran,
right? Exactly that, and
you have a good article about this. I want to point out in the National Interest, which you co-authored. So that's a good source of information about this.
And I think that was the point where the UAE started to think differently about its allies and think differently about how it can be a regional leader or a regional influencer if it doesn't have the US on its side. And Qatar is now an enemy country. So the Saudis were very hostile against Iran, but didn't help within this crisis, could not deliver any solution for that specific crisis in the summer of 2019. And the UAE started, I think, to feel isolated within their own region and try to find more and maybe other alliances or partners in the region. And I think that their first look was to Israel.
And also that they had their eyes on the F-35s that the U.S. is selling for that reason?
Among others.
Yeah.
I wouldn't point it as others do as the main cause of the Abrahamic Accords. I think the Abrahamic Accords are bigger than that, are much broader than that. They are concerned with very deep strategic thinking, long-term thinking. And if it was only about the F-35, I think we wouldn't have seen all these agreements today.
Okay, and let's we don't have time for a full analysis, but let's talk about Israel's interest. What exactly is Israel trying to do with this wonderful party?
So Israel has so many to learn and so many to earn from this new relationship, as the UAE does. Israel, we find, first of all, a country that sees Israel as a legitimate player, as a legitimate country in the Middle East, which is by far one of the most important things for Israel's sake. The other thing is that there are so many shared worldviews and values between the two countries.
Well, that's surprising for most of us to think about, right? After so many years when Israel had almost no relationship with the Middle East, or with the Arab Middle East. Tell us about these shared values. What are they?
So, for example, we mentioned when we talked about being a moderate or not, we mentioned the tolerance as a main value today in the Arab Gulf countries, specifically in the UAE. The UAE declared in year 2019 as the year of tolerance. They hosted the Pope, and they announced that they are going to build the Abrahamic Center, where a synagogue and a mosque and a church is going to be built in the same arena, on the same height, and it's going to be open for everyone. So they are really trying to demonstrate how they believe in tolerance and coexistence and in multiculturalism. And this is something that I think the Israelis will find shared ground with the Emiratis, because we really do love to portray our coexistence nature and the multicultural scene in Israel. And, only today I spoke with the municipality of Jerusalem about how to host the Emiratis that will arrive here. And that almost most of the conversation was about the multiculturalism in Jerusalem, how it will be something that I think that it will be very interesting for the Emiratis to see.
But I have to challenge you on this a little bit, because there's been such a deep argument in Israeli society, or tension, I should say, between Israel feeling itself to be part of the European West and suppressing or somehow disparaging its Middle Eastern heritage. This is, a major, I think, source of resentment of the Mizrahi population here. Do you think that what we're seeing now represents some sort of a shift or an opportunity to bring and, to embrace the Middle Eastern Arab roots of many of people in Israeli society?
Well, two things. One of them is that the Mizrahi trend in Israel, and I'm not an analyst of the Israeli politics, but we see this trend of the rising Mizrahi culture growing in the last maybe decade or so. And it has nothing to do with this agreement, but I think that also the fact that we were used to think in terms of Israel as an isolated country in the Middle East, as an island in the Middle East. We used to think in these terms. And also Netanyahu tried to deliver the point until 5 years ago, when he started to talk more and more about these moderate Sunni states, Arab states.
The moderate Sunni states,
right.
Yes. The legendary moderate Sunni states.
Right. So it started with that, and after that they had names, and and then we saw some visits of ministers, and all of a sudden we have friends in the Middle East. So that's a great shift that Netanyahu did from the paradigm that we are lost in, that we are ourselves, for our own selves in the Middle East, to the paradigm that we are not alone. We have friends. They might not be in the near circle, but we have friends somewhere in the Middle East. And I think that if we're going out of this political narratives that the rulers are really trying to deliver here, is that one of the things that Israel will earn from these agreements is that beyond these narratives, Israel will find that it is not alone in the Middle East, and it has a lot of mutual values and mutual ties that can work together.
Well, it sounds like this is going to really chip away at the sense that we are surrounded by a bunch of enemies who want to destroy us. So let me ask you that, using that as a segue, the big criticism, I think, from some people of these agreements is that they bypass the traditional Palestinian cause of depending on the Arab states to not normalize with Israel until there's some progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front. What does this mean for the Palestinians?
Well, the Palestinians, as we all know, are very upset with this agreement or with these agreements. We didn't see any diversity in the public opinions or in the political opinions that from the Palestinian side think that they are very much insulted by this step. I think it didn't start with that. I think it started with a deal of the century of Trump that was almost above their head, trying to make decisions in the Middle East without involving the Palestinians. And although the UAE was trying to, to portray this step as one that is in the favor of the Palestinians, because they really stopped the
annexation.
The annexation.
For the moment, at least, some of Netanyahu's colleagues in Likud claim that it's going to happen at some point, but it's paused.
Right. So they were trying to portray it as a step that really was for the benefit of the Palestinians, but the Palestinians didn't see that on the same page because of the fact that they were not part of this decision. I think it was only from that cause and not talking about political, pros and cons. So now we are in a situation where the UAE leadership and the leadership of the Palestinians do not talk with each other. They are hostile to each other. And
what about Bahrain? Bahrain, of course, hosted the first conference that was the exposition of the economic piece of the plan. Do the Palestinians blame Bahrain as much as the UAE?
With no Palestinian representatives in this conference. So yeah, it's an important point because it's a part of this regional development or regional dynamics of decision makings without the Palestinians. And
is there any way to turn it around and somehow eventually use this Abraham Agreement as a bridge? Or is it a lost cause? Palestinians are out of the game.
I think it might definitely be a bridge. And I'll tell you why. I think that what the Arab leaders in the Gulf are trying to say to the Palestinians and to the world now is that the Palestinian leadership had lost its legitimacy. I think that this is the main point. They would very much like to see a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's very important to them. Let's not get wrong here. The Palestinian cause is at the top of the foreign policy agenda of all of these states that we are talking about now. It did not stop being so, even though we the Israelis are trying to see this agreement as, contradicting to a solution. But from their eyes, from the Emirati eyes, and from the Bahraini eyes, it's a part of that. It's a part of that deal. And what they are actually saying is that we are waiting aside for the Palestinian leadership to switch roles and to change in order to take the further step. So this is the first step in order to solve the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And they're just waiting aside to see whether or when the leadership will change and when they could maybe be more influential on that arena.
Well, that's a fascinating open question. And as we begin to wrap up, I want to ask look in another part of the world. We haven't really talked about the West. How do you see the role of the U.S., which you touched on a little bit, and the role of Europe? I'm just asking for a friend. But this is part of a series sponsored by the German government in its hat as holding the rotating presidency of the Council of Europe. So how do you see the role of these other actors? What have they been doing right or wrong? And what could they be doing to encourage the better angels of this agreement? Right.
So an important issue to understand about the UAE is that the UAE is really trying to be as much diverse as they can in terms of political partners. They're not pulling all of their cards on one basket, and they're really trying to diverse that into other partners. We see that also with the rapprochement with the East, for example. They became much more closer to China in recent years, but also to Europe. We see that economically and we see that politically. Going to more partners and strengthening ties with other countries that were not used to be a part of this arena of the Gulf at all. So I think that this is the top goal of the UAE, not to be dependent as it was until, let's say, 15 years ago. It has the West, or maybe let's be more specific, the USA as its most important political partner and China as its most important economical partner. But now, in the last 15 years, the UAE made a shift in this political foreign policy, and diversification is one of the most important values that they are trying to reach today in order not to be a dependent country anymore.
That's fascinating. We've been talking with Moran Zaga, who's a lecturer at the University of Haifa, and I want to thank you for giving us your wisdom. This is a developing story, I think, and I'm sure if we come back to you in a year, we'll have maybe answers to some of these questions.
I hope so.
Thank you for being with us and talking about your various articles. And thanks also to Itai Shelem, our sound engineer and producer, and again to the German government for sponsoring this special series on Israel's relationship with EU and European countries, which looks at the broader Middle East as well. Now, a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we'd like you to please consider writing a review. Just go to the ratings and review section and write one. You too can support us by going to our website, tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing on our Patreon campaign. Check out our archive with about 600 interviews. We've practically lost count. If you like us, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast Ideas from Israel. Follow both me and Gilad on Twitter. And join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.